Thanks very much for that. Now, the point that Anthea did make in her comments, though, and came up in the report, was that our strong sense of belonging in Australia is trending down. That there are fewer of us who are saying we strongly identify as citizens of Australia. And I mean, what's the reason for that? Is it a continuing trend? And where's it going to end up? And what's the significance of it? So Anne, would you mind sort of putting your mind to that? And what's behind it? The fact that it seems the strong sense of belonging has trended down.
Oh, I always get the hard questions. Yeah. You know, in 2005, I did my PhD. You'll get there one day, Sammy, I'll make sure. And one of the things I did was I held focus groups with young people and asked them about how 9/11 in particular, a huge world event, had affected them and had affected what they saw themselves as in Australia and where they positioned themselves in Australia. And it was quite, I wouldn't say so eye-opening, because as a Muslim woman myself, I could relate to what they were saying. But I had young men in tears in those focus groups, telling me that just a few years ago, they felt completely Australian. They had no question about their identity. They felt, if anyone had asked them anything, they were so 100% Australian. And that now they were being told that just by virtue of their religion, they were no longer Australian. And they felt a great sense of loss. It was a great sense of loss. It was very, very hurtful to them. So I think there are several factors to this downward trend in a sense of belonging. I think much of it has come from a political climate over the past 10 years that has progressively used national security and the fear of terrorism in ways that are perhaps not as conducive as they could have been to promoting social harmony and ensuring that social harmony remains one of our strengths here in Australia. I think that's a big part of it. But I also think the idea of the global citizen, and that we are going through a period where we are trying to, a period of transition, where at the end of this period of transition there will be a much clearer path for the future generations, or a much clearer way for future generations of identifying both as global citizens and as citizens of a nation state. I think the idea of nation states and borders and countries is something that young people in particular, with social media and with the world being much smaller now than it was when I was growing up back in the dinosaur era, you know, I think that this is a period of transformation and change for future generations. We have a lot of work to do in Australia. We're doing pretty good. We're doing pretty good. But we must never ever let that be our endpoint. We've got to continually work hard at improving social harmony, improving cohesion, ensuring that this sense of belonging does not continue to go on the decline, that we start addressing that. You know, I can talk a little bit later as the panel progresses about some of the ways that we can do that, because I...
Okay, all right, Dan, thanks very much for that. Can I just share something with you? And this, as a sort of a West Australian born and bred, some years ago I was overseas with my family, and the guide was showing us around, and he said to us in the group, he said, "Where are you from?" And various people said, "Oh, we're here, there, and everywhere." Pointed to me and said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Western Australia." And later on, my wife said to me, "Why didn't you say Australia?" And I thought, well, actually, that was a very good point. That's a very good point. But that, Ken Michael, you might understand that. But that certainly tells us something about Western Australia. But, Anne, let's go to the point about the sense of belonging. Ken, how important is that sense of belonging? And Anne suggested how, you know, it's important to rest the slide. How do you do it? Got some suggestions?
Well, a sense of belonging is certainly fundamental to the social cohesion and being part of this nation. Suggestions? You know, I read the statistics and it did concern me, and I started to think, why would they go down? And obviously the question of dual citizenship was one of the issues. The other one was global citizenship. But perhaps we're not selling it as well as we should as a country. Perhaps we're not getting the messages out there as to what it means to be a good citizen. Perhaps we're not telling people the benefits that you can receive from being a good citizen, not only in return to yourself, but return to your community and return to the people that you're there with. So I think there are opportunities, and perhaps it's a role not only for government, but it's a role also for each of us to spend and speak the benefits of being a good citizen, to explain it to people, to bring it through schools from an education basis, to bring in civics so that we have got the very elements. But perhaps we're slipping in not telling the stories as well as we should, and perhaps we should reflect on that.
Hass, do you think the slide should be is something concerning, or is it sort of a price you pay for sort of the internationalisation of the country? You know, it's changing.
It certainly is changing, and I think, but those of us who see ourselves as global citizens are not really abandoning our identities, such as allegiances or loyalty to countries, or ethnicities or political beliefs. I think these are traditional identities giving meaning to our lives, and they'll continue to give meaning to our lives and help shape who we are. However, as a result of living in a globalised world, we understand that we have this added layer of responsibility, and why shouldn't people be feeling that they need to be responsible? How can you not be touched by famine or conflict overseas? Because of rapid transportation and technology, we are so close, so these will affect us. But can I just add on to Anne's comment about why there may be also, in addition to the sense of belonging diminishing in some, I think the use of language has a lot to do with it in our society as well. I mean, the way we term phrases, whether it's multiculturalism, productive diversity, sense of belonging, social cohesion, these start to become words for the media to play with, becomes quite divisive in the community. Some are deliberate and some are uninformed. And unfortunately, this creates a very negative perception in our community. I mean, the fact that we can argue about what multiculturalism is, I mean, that we can't simply accept the fact that it is nothing but a simple policy to help people integrate so they can make their contributions to society is something that we need to understand. We need to be using language that says that multiculturalism actually stems out of Australian democracy, not the other way around. And I think when we start using language that is uninformed or divisive, we'll create a sense where people don't feel belong, because what happens is actually it's the people on the street that get targeted, and they're the people that don't belong, which makes a great impact on communities.
Sammy, just come to you. What's going to influence you in the timing of your decision to become a citizen? And is this sort of declining recognition, I suppose? Is this a factor? Have you noticed this?
Look, am I not going to become a citizen? That's not a possibility. I mean, I am on the pathway to citizenship. I look forward to becoming a citizen one day. There's a certain, for a variety of reasons, there's a book about it, you can buy that. But the main thing for me is, especially when it links to things like belonging. Okay, so I live in a small town. I live in Northam, right? I go to the pub. Most of my friends are farmers. The other half are old Serco employees at the Yonga Hill Detention Centre. I'm a stand-up comedian. I perform in comedy clubs across Australia. Means most of the time my audiences are 90% white people. Half of them are usually drunk. The other half are making out. I mean, I have a fairly diverse experience when it comes to meeting people across Australia. Tomorrow I'm off to Barracuda for a gig. A day after that, Kellerberrin. So I see a lot of Australia that a lot of immigrants, for example, don't. That Australia that I see and am exposed to is extremely cohesive and extremely welcoming. I've never had a problem there. I think the only time I've ever had a problem in Australia where someone tried to make me feel alienated was when I was in Mandurah for a comedy show and there was a neo-Nazi in the audience. But that's just the risk of my career. The problems that I have when I feel alienated by Australia come whenever I turn on the television, or when I read the newspaper, or when I go online. Because online and on TV and everything, Australia is the most polarized society I've been exposed to. And I was in America during the Bush-Al Gore era. I was in Pakistan my entire life, and it's shocking over here. The whole liberal versus labor versus everyone, rather this side or that side, the current government comes in and says, either you agree with us or you're not Australian, which is the tonality that keeps coming out. There's two things that really affected me on a personal level, and a lot of immigrants that I spoke to. One was when George Brandeis had made his statement that freedom of speech means the freedom to be a bigot. Now, as a comedian, I agree with that, by the way. It's not a very popular thing to say, but I actually agree with that. Freedom of speech is the freedom to be a bigot. However, that right of bigotry was protected for someone like Andrew Bolt, for example, but not for someone like Zaki Mullah. So Zaki Mullah might be an idiot who wears a baseball cap on television, but he should have the same freedom to say what he wants that Andrew Bolt does. So all of a sudden, there were lines drawn where I was like, okay, there's some things I can say, some things I can't say. And then the other aspect that kind of really came in was the whole Adam Goodes affair, where I went on stage afterwards and I was discussing with the audience, and one of the things I pointed out was everyone kept saying it was an Aboriginal dance, it was an Aboriginal dance. No one actually said it was an Australian dance, which is what it was, technically, and factually, actually. But that was the moment where I kind of had this realization where I was like, okay, even he's not considered Australian enough for the Australian audiences and for the Australian public and Australian media. What chance does someone like me have? Now, everyone I've ever met has been welcoming and wonderful and kind and generous, but that's anecdotal experience compared to what's shown to me on television, which tells me you will always be an alien. And just to confirm that, even though one day you might become a citizen, that's never going to be something that's safe for you.
So the welcome is up to a point. It's sort of, everyone's welcome up to a point. Is this the point?
Welcome is on a personal level, but not on an official level. Oh. That's the difference.
Yeah. All right. Hass, do you have a thought on that?
Look, I think the best way to explain it is through your own experience, in terms of how you feel and those experiences that they do make an impact on you. But I think, for me, it would be marvellous to progress to a point where we no longer need labels to describe who we are, other than just simply Australians, of diverse cultures, that has so much richness and a strong Indigenous history, 50,000-year Indigenous history, and a very rich and modern migrant history, and the contributions that everyone makes. And I think sometimes when we start to pursue on labels, we actually do create problems for ourselves, because what happens is those labels start to become hijacked for a whole range of reasons, and I think do create these real life situations that make it very difficult. So I think we do have challenges ahead of us, but as a nation though, everyday people that I witness and I'm out in the streets there, it's just a wonderful feeling, but we do have those issues.
Now, good things do happen. Good things do happen. They happen often very slowly, however. And in state parliament today, you might be interested to know there was a debate on constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians. Mm. And there's cross-party support for it. Josie Farah, who's the Labor member for Kimberley, is Aboriginal, of course, leading light in it, and she's pushing it through, and it's got cross-party support. And it's going to happen. In the Western Australian state constitution, it'll happen, and it'll happen soon. And as I say, good things happen, but sometimes they happen very slowly. But let's be thankful that they are happening. Now, one more question before we go to the floor, or before we go, to the floor. The issue of temporary visas and their pathways to permanent citizenship. Temporary visas, it's been a very topical. What are the social and economic impacts of increasing the number of temporary visas and pathways to permanent citizenship? Anne, do you mind leading off on that?
I think this idea of welcoming, individuals being welcoming, but the system, the substantive system not being welcoming has a huge implication here for those on temporary visas, whether they be 457s or people who are in the past have been under temporary protection visas, for example, and I'm not sure whether they're back again, the TPVs, are they? They are. You know, I think that temporary citizenship is kind of like limbo land, isn't it? It's a bit like you're here and but you're not really one of us. So I think that the social implications of keeping people on temporary visas for long periods of time, particularly when we look at growing and developing a sense of belonging, but also in not just an individual sense of belonging, but it has to be bigger than that. Yes, individuals need to feel that they belong, but I want to live in a society where this sense of belonging is not something that is such a difficult individual responsibility. I want to live in a society where this sense of belonging comes naturally to people, that they don't have to question it, that they don't watch the media or they don't look at the political rhetoric and go, oh, wait a minute, do I really belong? Am I really Australian? You know, I think those on temporary visas have a lot to contribute to Australia, both socially and economically, and they have contributed a lot to Australia, both socially and economically. So in keeping people on temporary visas for too long, I think can start to chip away at that at an individual and group level. So I think this is something that needs to be addressed quite urgently. And I also want to just quickly talk about this idea of Australian values, because with global events, our fallback position has tended to be to say that, okay, we need to reiterate and strengthen our commitment to Australian values. And that then became Australian values as opposed to other values, the values of the other. Whenever you start to talk about Australian values or any kind of values as being not something else or not somebody else's values, you immediately create an us and them. And I think that, you know, over the past decade and a half, this has been something that has been bubbling along in Australia. The language of Australian values is highly politically laden, and it's at a point now where you are not Australian if you don't express some kind of commitment, or you don't demonstrate, or you don't praise Australian values. But I don't know what those Australian values are, and I don't know that anybody does.
Could I just come in at that point?
Come in by all means.
To make the situation a bit more complex.
Oh, thank you.
What we have is movement in many different directions simultaneously, not in one direction. So, for example, the debates about the place of Muslim Australians in Australian society, which as you so rightly point out, has been driven in a certain direction. It has the paradoxical effect that it's actually increased sense of belonging within the mainstream. Mm-hmm. So when the Scanlon Foundation did a snap poll in October after much politicised discussion, what we actually found was that the indicators of people in the mainstream, the indicators of belonging, had actually gone up. So I'm introducing that to say that it's a very complex situation. If you actually looked at the problems, you might actually think that the sense of belonging in this country is around 50%, but it's actually around 90%. So it just really highlights that. Further, with the proposals to strip citizenship, again, that has very wide buy-in. There are two separate polls independently done with different methodologies that found that 75% of people support the moves by the government. So I just wanted to interject that issue that what we have is currents moving in many directions and issues which may serve to alienate a significant section of the population, but nonetheless a section that's less than, say, 5% of the total population, is going to produce a result that is not necessarily mirrored in the mainstream.
Thanks, Andrew. Often you hear someone say if a leader, a public figure, wants to put the heat on someone who's been critical, they say that comment is un-Australian, or that behaviour is un-Australian. Now, the point you make, it's a very loose term, but no one really knows what it means. But that's the comments that's made. Ken?
Thank you. Thanks for those comments. I'd just like to make a comment on values themselves. And you need to have strong values if you're going to be united in any way, if you're going to bond between yourselves and the causes that you have. And I accept Anne's comment about what do we mean by Australian values. And often we hear words like fairness and mateship and other things like that, which are very important. But there's some fundamental values like integrity, respect, compassion, that binds you wherever you may be, whatever religion you may have, whatever race you may be. And that is mutual respect for each other, caring for each other, making sure that there is someone they can turn to if they need support, and that caring and compassionate attitude, and as well as acting with integrity and guiding people in any way they can, helps to unite us as a nation and helps to offer opportunities to individuals to be able to come forward. So having values, to me, is fundamental to the success of having belonging and social cohesion.
Anthea, do you have a comment to make on discussion so far on behalf of the Foundation?
Oh, on behalf of the Foundation.
Well, on behalf of yourself.
Well, I was just, one of the things that I looked up before I came was actually what are Australia's values? And they're not what I would necessarily think of as values, whereas I think what Ken has just talked about are societal mores, societal expectations. And I think part of the discussion has been about that we as everybody in society actually have a responsibility to talk about what those societal expectations are. Australia's values are things like the rule of law and democracy and those things, which I don't think most people would consider values in and of themselves, but it's still important elements of what makes up Australia, but not necessarily values as such. So I think what we're really trying to do here is to encourage as much discussion as possible amongst everybody about what sort of society do I want to live in, what's my contribution to that. And if I think into the future, how can I ensure that everybody sitting around me has an ability to contribute to that future?